This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. As vaccines roll out more broadly and countries begin to get the coronavirus under control, attention will turn to the recovery and a return to normal operations for the drug manufacturing industry. The supply chain will play an integral role in this effort and will itself emerge in a different shape, with transportation, warehousing, and API sourcing looking much different than it did pre-COVID. Today, we're going to have a great discussion with Chris Flask, talking about a few trends and we will take a long-range look at this arm of the industry. So it's so great to have you back here with us, Chris. We've heard so much about the supply chain throughout this entire pandemic. And I know that a lot of what you do is going to change in some ways, sometimes small and sometimes big, but I'm excited to have this conversation today. So thanks for being here with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It has been an interesting year, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of learning.
Absolutely. No, I definitely agree. And it's going to be one of those things that some of it will be trial and error too. But we've certainly learned so much, I think, already. And the pandemic, because the pandemic really did kind of highlight the supply chain inefficiencies, some of them, some bigger than others, unfortunately, across the globe. Drug and supply shortages, lack of planning were front and center, forcing the industry to really accelerate digital capabilities and more. So how have you seen outsourcing, digitization, and e-commerce grow as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and as we said, there's been so much going on. I guess there's a couple of maybe caveats I want to start my answer with on this. Obviously, the pandemic's not over yet, so we're still learning. We're still going through it. The other thing, though, I want to highlight is we have to be careful in our kind of evaluation to not overemphasize as well, right? Because we certainly can't design supply chains to be completely resistant to what is maybe a once in a 100-year activity. So if we do that, if we try to build a completely bulletproof supply chain, we're going to incur costs that are going to be exorbitant. So we need to avoid the tendency to overreact, but understand where we are seeing the highlighted gaps in our supply chain and business continuity that need to be addressed. So it is important that we don't overreact. And
that's a great point, Chris. That really is a great point, because we could build a bulletproof supply chain and nobody could afford it, right?
Yeah, and we don't want to create these costs and pass them on to patients or whomever.
Right. Absolutely.
That aren't necessary. But so that's going to be the sweet spot as we go back through and learn from what's been going on. Is this a common cause variation or a special cause variation to our process disruption? And what do we want to address, and what do we want to say? Look, we have to accept that level of risk. So some things around transportation, and we can get into that later, we probably do need to address and do need to understand where we created more risk than we probably needed to, whether it was a result of the pandemic or just in general exposure to risks that we may incur that are similar to what we saw in the pandemic, but we may see in other disruptions going forward. So I think that's going to be part of the evaluation. But to your point, there's actually some really positive things that have happened with digitization and with understanding our relationships with third-party outsourcing. So, man, if I could go back in time and invest in DocuSign, I'd certainly do that, right? So now here we are in this new way of working where everybody's having to approve documentation and we don't get wet signatures. Look at DocuSign, its stock's gone up 400% over the last year because all these companies are looking to it as a solution to how do we, if we're doing customs assignments and approvals, we need to get those documented, and we can't just go to the office next to us and have somebody sign off on it. And it's exploded. And actually,
and not everyone has a fax machine in their house, right? Like,
no. Hopefully few do at this point, but it's well, the interesting part about that is I think for many companies, that was a solution they were actually pushing to go to even before the pandemic, right? They were seeking this digital approach to managing documents, but because of compliance concerns, quality concerns, it was there was an activation energy that just couldn't be achieved. Well, the pandemic gave you that activation energy, and I don't expect to see that go back. I see, in fact, perhaps seeing the success of that going forward. I would expect to see it perhaps things like that digitalization solution move forward. So that was a really, in my mind, one of the positive things that came out of how we manage our information flows from the pandemic, but also, in alignment with that, how we've leveraged cloud solutions, collaborative software. I mean, luckily, many companies were in that space beforehand. But again, it really pushed further into the business as people couldn't kind of cooperate or collaborate personally with each other. So that was another takeaway. And the kind of looking towards solutions and partnering. One of the things that happened, and I think it was almost a year ago today, if I were to look back a year ago, one of the big issues I was dealing with at the time was we had lost all of our transportation capacity when when airlines stopped flying. And we were having to look at how do we move materials, and starting to then realize how important our relationships were with our third-party freight forwarders. These are folks who are experts in these fields, who have the connections into the different capacity of freight or carriers. So understanding just how important those relationships were was critical to us being successful in doing that. And even and this is sort of interesting and something I'd like to see continue going forward, our relationships with some of our competitors, right? I mean, while they are competitors, we all needed to get medicine to certain regions of the world, and planes weren't flying. So, we had to kind of coordinate with each other to say, you've chartered this plane and you're not using all its capacity. Can we share some of that capacity? And it's a really interesting concept, especially as you think forward into things like freight, shipping freight, sea freight, where you have large capacity, but maybe not full utilization by one company. How do we create a sort of collaboration between companies requiring freight that don't normally work together? So I thought that was an interesting avenue that we went down when things really, really got tight, and we'll see if those bonds break as the shipping market or the freight market opens up a little bit more. But it was really rewarding to have those experiences with our other companies within the industry as we were trying together to get through this hard time.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the collaborations across the industry, the collaborations that happened or have happened and continue to happen during the pandemic were really instrumental in keeping us moving forward in a lot of ways, not just with supply chain and logistics and moving things around, but really in the whole drug development life cycle, it seems. So, I mean, there's another positive, as you put it, to the pandemic. So, I'm happy that we were able to pull together as an industry and make things happen. Yeah. Chris, as we've seen, so much of our day-to-day lives were put on hold during this pandemic. And for some people, they are still working remotely. Are you or are we as an industry expecting a resurgence in some of the facets of supply chain that were extremely important pre-COVID? Things like intelligent forecasting and trends for inventory control, and more, labor shortages in logistics, as well as sustainability efforts here in the U.S. What does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, so I think we will see those things coming back, but what we will see them coming back as, so in many cases, those things became useful during the pandemic. As when we talk about intelligent forecasting, we leverage some of that, but now understanding the importance of having those kinds of accurate forecasts, or even understanding the limits and constraints that we have in logistics, I think we're going to rethink some of our inventory strategies now that we can, when you have that sort of worst case scenario, it really put, now you have a 10 to measure your risk against, right? Before, what you thought was a 10 was not a 10.
Yeah.
Now you know what a 10 really looks like. It really starts to go,
it's all
okay,
about perspective.
It's all about perspective. You thought before that having an airline strike was perhaps a 10 risk on your deployment strategies or your distribution strategies, and that's maybe now a 7, right?
Right.
versus
Right.
a global pandemic where all airlines stopped flying for 6-7 months. So it does put perspective on that. And it does make you rethink some of the approaches you had towards inventory, and how what requirements you have for moving things around. So if we know that, I don't know what to be honest with you, for transportation, for ground transportation, it didn't take as much of a hit, although we've seen historically that we've had shortages in drivers. We were able to maintain that during the pandemic, and we didn't have as much issue with that. But what I don't know is in airlines, and as they deal with the changes in their business models, what that will look like as far as our capacities. And we can talk about that a little bit later too, but there's been significant changes there. So I don't know that I see that in coming back to pre-pandemic levels anytime in the near future. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out, but I think it's going to cause many companies to rethink, and has caused many companies to rethink their approach towards distribution, leveraging different modalities like air freight. I think you're going to see more of a shift toward, at least out of passenger belly freight, into perhaps more classical air freight, or even moving, I know companies are moving over more towards sea freight. And it's been an interesting competition between sea freight and air freight, as I think sea freight looked and said, oh, air freight's having some problems, here's an opportunity for us, and really pushed into the market to say, we can be a solution for you guys. You may have been reluctant, but here's your activation energy to get your quality groups on board with putting stuff on boats and sailing it. So that's been sort of an interesting change. And I don't know that, again, we will see things shift back towards at least belly freight, passenger belly freight, due to the risk and the changeable nature. And even beyond the pandemic, if you think about it. So I think I read recently, there's a story where in the EU, in some countries in the EU, they're starting to ban flights that are less than 2 hours, right, for sustainability reasons. So now you've got less flights, you've got less passenger flights, you've got less belly freight. And if those trends continue, then that might cause companies to think differently about, is this really the best place to put our distribution strategy? So I think and I know even before the pandemic, companies were looking at sustainability as a reason to rethink some of their distribution models.
Yeah, absolutely. And that does make sense. And for, we hear sustainability across industries, not just in pharma, but a lot of different industries are working on sustainability plans and trying to more closely manage their carbon footprint, right? So it makes sense that we would also be doing that in our distribution efforts here. And given the magnitude of the pandemic, it's certainly reasonable to expect many lasting effects on the supply chain, in addition to the distribution and transportation items that you just alluded to, such as greater emphasis on redundancy, proximity, and resilience, which may be part of the sustainability that you just talked about, but can you talk about how you see these playing out over the next few years and again for the long run?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned before, we do still need to be careful about how far we swing our pendulum with respect to modifications to our supply chain in reaction to this specific event. But we do need to be thoughtful and really look at where do we see this gap. So what I see actually happening, instead of specifically making decisions around, okay, we need to, and although I will see some of, I do expect to see some of this where we say, look, we saw that this transportation lane is extremely susceptible to interruptions, maybe not just because of the pandemic, but it's just prone to interruption because of many things. This was one, but we saw it in these other issues over here. And I can certainly see them rethinking some of that. But I actually think, in my mind, what's going to be more helpful for companies, and what I'm seeing start to happen, is this renewed focus on business continuity management, that it's not a check the box exercise.
Right.
There's a quote from General Eisenhower that plans are nothing, planning is everything, right? The important part is spending the time to think about some of these things, but plans rarely survive the first contact with the enemy. So you can't just expect that you're going to have a ready-made solution to everything that comes up,
right,
but instead you'll have an approach to deal with it. And that's where I see the energy being spent, right? Developing what is our war room plan? If something happens, how do we make sure that we have visibility to information, that we have the right people for decision making available, and that they can come together and evaluate the situation and make a solution based on the ground truth, what's playing out in front of us. I see that as much more important. What is our process behind dealing with the issue, rather than having a specific binder on a shelf that I can pull out and say, okay, it's a 100-year pandemic, this is our playbook, right? We'd have a whole library full of playbooks, and none of them would exactly fit what is happening before you. In a related situation, I remember being asked a few years ago to put together a response plan to earthquakes for warehouses on the West Coast. And, I shared with the person who was asking me about it, well, we have agreements in place with logistics providers to respond to our need to move materials. So if we've got API, millions, billions of dollars of API in various warehouses on the West Coast that have been impacted by a warehouse or by an earthquake, we have trucks that we have contracts with logistics service providers to bring trucks to our sites on very short notice. But I guarantee you, if that were to happen, those contracts would be up in the air due to acts of God clauses, and that those service providers would have every one of their clients on the phone trying to get those trucks to them. So, I don't know that the solution really is how do we react to the earthquake, but how do we prepare for the earthquake, right? Do we have, a revenue at risk strategy that spreads that inventory out in a much better way? Because even if we could get the trucks, even if the service providers had trucks to bring to us, I don't know that they could get in the warehouse. I don't know that the roads would be passable. It doesn't matter that we have this plan in place if once we get into it, we realize none of those pieces fit. So it's really more, how do we prepare, for that disruption, and how do we bring the resources together to make the decisions to react to whatever the actual reality is in place. So I can see that coming out of the pandemic to say, here's the shortcoming we saw in our response plan. Here's what we didn't have as far as visibility of information. Here's who wasn't at the decision making, who should have been there, as we saw when things played out and we didn't have the right solutions presented. I would see that being a much more worthy effort than necessarily designing more and more plans, specifically for a pandemic, if that makes sense.
I think that's such a great point, Chris. I think we've heard a lot of people talking about, we need to have, these solutions sort of in our back pocket. in case this happens again or something like it happens again. But as you've just mentioned, like no two instances are going to be the same, and no two
Right.
companies are going to need the same support. So I think having your processes, understanding your processes as an organization, and then really knowing that collective knowledge that exists within your team and being able to leverage that and bring people together as a team and say, all right, let's figure this out. Like we have the knowledge, we know what our processes are, we can come up with a solution. And I think that's a much
Yeah.
smarter way to respond.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's where we saw some gaps in folks just trying to get their response teams together and understand, in the initial phases of the pandemic, and the pandemic's a bit unique because it was sort of while there was an initial shock, it was sort of a slow moving disaster versus, a fire, for example, or an earthquake or some other tornado or a natural disaster like that, where it's a much more short term. So at least in the pandemic, we had the ability to kind of learn and adjust as the months went along. But you may not have that. You may not have that ability in some other disruption. So at least having a really clear business continuity plan, clear understanding from the players what their roles are in decision making, governance. That's what turned out to be sort of a difference maker as we move through the pandemic.
Thanks. That's I mean, like, such a great point. Like, as I mentioned, Chris, learning from our mistakes, which, you said we've been doing all along. We've made mistakes. We made some good decisions too, obviously, but we always want to learn from, gather knowledge, and move forward in the best ways possible. Do you think the ways in which we approach the need for close monitoring and inventory development, planning, and applying efficient warehousing processes, are we going to see impacts there? Are those going to be more important going forward? Now we have the benefit, the hindsight of all of what we've learned.
Yeah, they will, but what's been interesting. So yes, they certainly will come into play, and I think what folks are going to be looking at is, for example, it turns out we may not have enough nodes in our network to manage during disruption. So if we're building big warehouses in remote areas, that's great from a cost perspective, but it may not be great from a service level perspective if we're undergoing certain interruptions in the system. So, and with that really calls into question, what are our strategies in partnering with logistics providers, right? Because a company doesn't want to necessarily take on the responsibility or the capital costs of building 50 warehouses all over, their supply regions. That 50 small ones, but logistics service providers already have those.
Right.
How do we partner with them to say, okay, you've got warehouses or different storage conditions and storage types, and that was another huge issue, was cold chain. Can we partner with you to make up this gap that we are now seeing? That it's great that I have all this material sitting in a warehouse in Italy, but Italy's shut off. And it would have been more helpful if I had several warehouses in different areas versus, one big warehouse in Italy that we now can't get to. But, again, the company doesn't want to carry that on their books. So can we have more strategic relationships? And I see the big LSPs like DHL or XPO, I see them realizing that, certainly in the pharma industry, that's an opportunity for them. And there are meetings that are happening to say, this is how we can be a better strategic partner for you in managing, some of the issues that you experienced. So I think we are going to rethink, what our inventory levels are geographically and try to spread that risk out. I think the hindrances we've had prior to the pandemic and doing some of those, again, activation energy, but also if we try to manage it internally, we didn't have the tools to create the visibility that we needed to do it. But our partners in our 4PLs and 3PLs have been developing those tools. We just haven't really asked them to help us do some of these things. So we're learning from that. I could see us definitely crafting some better, more impactful contractual relationships with these 4PLs and 3PLs to provide us that kind of security and that kind of support in a pre-pandemic world.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And in addition to warehousing, where things are stored, and we've seen various steps of the drug manufacturing and distribution process, which they occur, all over the world. We source drugs from or APIs from certain areas. We might get equipment or PPE or whatever, you name it, right? Which all in the end really lessens the control that we might have over our end product, to your point. So do you expect changes in this practice in addition to the warehousing efforts, whether it's sourcing ingredients from supplier locations and involvement? I heard early on during the pandemic of some potential FDA efforts to limit where we could get our things from or mandate what we needed to do with the supply list that we might need to keep, and et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I think it varies by product. It varies by the criticality of that product. And certainly during the pandemic, what we saw was a high level of scrutiny on our supply chain for pandemic related medicines, rightly so, right? And how reliant we were on, and not from a political nature, but for example, China, for some of our raw materials. But if we can't get shipments out of China because they're closed down due to pandemic, does that create an issue for our ability to supply that product to the market? So there was quite a bit of scrutiny, and I would expect to see that continue. I mean, I think there's always been that a certain level of that, but I think it's been heightened. I know there have been some executive orders about security of our medical supply chain that came out of the pandemic. I even saw some examples where countries, governments were mandating certain inventory levels of critical medicines be kept. So if a company was producing in a country, if it would belong to that country, the government bodies could come down and say, look, we think that medicine's important to the pandemic. We want to make sure we have enough for our country before you ship it out to other countries. So you need to keep this much in reserve for us. And so that was happening all over the place too, which was of course playing havoc with our supply chain, just thinking, okay, we were expecting to ship these materials to these other countries that need it, and now we can't. How are we going to react to these sorts of things? And this is happening overnight, literally overnight. These sort of constraints and restrictions are coming down. So hopefully these government agencies take a step back and maybe think through some expectations that would allow us to plan better as they've learned from this experience, and I'm sure that will happen. But I think there's a couple parts of that question though I want to address too. Is there will always. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, so that being said, I wondered if you are anticipating, a long-term reluctance to utilize foreign suppliers. I mean, at least from our U.S. perspective, and if we'll really start to see a shift from offshore to nearshore preferences.
I haven't seen that yet, and I would be surprised. I think again, for some critical materials, yes, that will happen. But I don't think you're going to see it widespread, depending on what those materials were. On the other end of it, though, on the distribution piece, so there will be, I think what they've identified is kind of a list of materials that they've deemed critical that we will need to make sure that we're supporting the production of that in the United States so that we aren't reliant on foreign exports to maintain these critical materials. So that has happened. I don't know off the top of my head what the list of those materials are, but I know.
Yeah, I mean, they have that on the FDA website somewhere, but
yeah. So that's going to happen. I don't think, many companies are global, so they're, they're being, it's not just necessarily a US issue. They're trying to figure out exactly how do we manage that. But the other piece of that is where do we do API manufacturing? Where do we do drug product manufacturing? Where do we do packaging? And how was that disrupted as we went through the supply chain during the pandemic? The problem, so I as a supply planner, I'm sure they would love to be able to consolidate those activities all in one region and not be reliant on transportation in between different steps in that process. Because if as we couldn't fly API to the drug product sites in Europe from the US, it created a problem. And it would be great to do that drug product manufacturing in the US along with the API where it's produced. And I anticipate seeing some of that happening. There are limits, though, due to manufacturing capacities in drug product facilities. We're in many cases, due to trying to best utilize those drug product facilities, they're sort of maxed out. So we can't throw a whole lot more. We can't just say, okay, now we're going to do all this manufacturing in the U.S. when those U.S. sites are already full. How do we shift some of that?
Right.
The other piece, though, that a lot of people don't know about is we actually have agreements with certain countries. Different companies will have agreements with countries that require a certain level of manufacturing happening in that country for many reasons. To drive jobs in that. So if we want to distribute product to that country, we have to tell them, we have to set up manufacturing capacity in that country in order to do it. And many times the country is looking to develop that capability themselves, and so they're looking for companies to bring it to them, and they take it and go on their own way with it. But it's part of the cost of doing business in that country is to guarantee we will do some level of manufacturing in that country. Now, we try to keep that towards the end of the manufacturing process, but that may not always be what's approved or accepted by that country looking to have the product being made. So while it would be great to just do packaging there and packaging with a label that is in the language of that country, that kind of thing, sometimes they want more than just the packaging piece. And so
that's not always enough for them, right? They want a little more control sometimes.
Yeah, they want to, and it's really, in many cases, it's to develop the capability in their country to do that, not just for one company, but for many companies. And if I'm a government agency in a country, I want to create jobs in my country. I want to create opportunities. So it makes sense. It disrupts the supply chain.
It's good economic development, right?
Yeah, it's their approach.
It's good economic development on their part. So I get it. It makes sense. I wasn't aware, but it does make sense.
Yeah, but it plays havoc when it doesn't necessarily allow you to optimize your supply chain, and it causes you sometimes to have to make capital investments in ways that may not make the most sense. However, what I've seen as more of the trend now is companies going more towards leveraging single-use technologies and sort of plug-and-play facilities that they can almost pop up manufacturing that they can plop down in a country so that it's sort of a plug and play versus, especially in our business in pharma, it's very strict and very complicated to do some of our manufacturing processes. So you can't necessarily expect to drop it into some of these countries and that they are going to be able to meet the standards of production required for medical release, even by their own regulatory bodies. So to make that successful, we have to sort of make it foolproof and easy, sort of single use. You don't have to worry about cleaning validation and some of these other aspects if they're going to do manufacturing in that area. So there has been some work in how do we create sort of these facilities that can just be plopped into a country so they can do that manufacturing.
Sure. So as we've been talking, Chris, we obviously have seen that the just-in-time approach to inventory, although successful in driving down cost overall, is prone to failure if there are any disruptions in the process. And we've seen that happen. And I'm just wondering if this just-in-time approach is going to, if we're going to see a shift in that, and they're going to be, producing more of the regularly used drugs ahead of time, or what does this mean, to the supply chain professionals and the industry at large, from your perspective?
Yeah, again, I would say, I don't know that we're going to, I think there's going to be a revision on what we mean by just in time as far, I think just in time is going to continue, but I think what we'll see is, in order to support that just in time, what kind of back end production capacity do we need? How do we deal with, do we have a more resilient and flexible network to meet that production requirement? If this plant goes down or if this region goes out, how do we reroute quickly, bring resources quickly and react? I don't know that we're going to, there's going to be a certain level of inventory build regardless. I've seen that across the networks, even as we speak, where a lot of companies are building up where they can. There's actually quite a bit going on right now due to the vaccine, where companies can't build up inventory for certain direct materials because they're all being routed to vaccine production, and it's creating some havoc. So I think that's where you'll see some interesting discussions post-pandemic with some of these critical providers for materials like filters. There's a worldwide shortage on some of these GMP filters that are needed not just for vaccine production, but for biopharma in general, and even pharma production. So I think there's going to be some discussions with some of these key providers for those materials to enable us to do just in time during these sort of disruptions. So that's where I would see us looking at, okay, maybe not necessarily building up our API or our finished goods, though there will be some of that, but it's how do we make sure, and that's where I've actually seen the inventory builds is more in the direct materials and strategic inventories for direct materials to bring on production for these APIs, simply because you don't want to keep up too much inventory of drug product or API that expires, right? But filters don't expire, right? So sure. Those kinds of things where you can avoid the cost of expiration or obsolescence in your key products, and build up the ability to sort of react to shortages. So yeah, I would see that being more the strategy than building up a whole lot more inventory of finished goods.
Totally makes sense that those non-expirable products are a lot easier to store and have on hand than APIs or other things that have expiration dates. I hadn't thought about that when I asked the question, but that makes total sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some limits, right? I mean, you can't. Again, back to the base question we've been talking about, which is, how much do you reorganize your supply chain to be able to survive a pandemic? Again, I think it's going to be more about how quickly can we react and overcome versus building up a lot of additional infrastructure that you don't need 90% of the time, but only need during a pandemic. So, I don't know that we like. So, for example, one issue that I think pharma has been dealing with for a long time has been production capacity in its plants. Mm-hmm. Many plants, for cost reasons, have been run at 95%. Do we invest in a new plant, or do we keep running these plants at 95%? I think we're thinking things like that, if we can keep our agility factor for plant production down more like 80% so that we can react and bring in capacity in a much more strategic way, I think that's much more, a much better way to deal with what potential shortages there could be than building up a lot of inventory that could then expire, and we have to write off the cost for that. So I think that's where people are starting to really appreciate. We've in some ways paid lip service to that issue, and not just production capacity, but warehousing storage capacity. We paid some lip service to this concept of resiliency or agility factors.
Mhm.
I think people really learned how important that was over the last year when we couldn't react. And, the only way to solve some of these problems were higher inventories.
Yeah. We learned through submersion, right?
Yeah, true.
That's for sure. So, Chris, I want to talk a little bit more about technology and what it means to the future of supply chain management. I know you mentioned DocuSign at the onset of our chat here as being critical in terms of contracts and other things like that. But whether it's technology to monitor cold chain temperature ranges or data traceability, risk management and monitoring, I can imagine that those sorts of digital technologies have become increasingly important for supply chain. And I wonder not only how important those are to you now, but how much more the industry or the supply chain industry will be embracing technology as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a great question. I think again, there were a lot of efforts towards I think there's been a lot of efforts towards digitalization for a number of years. And
certainly a lot of talk about it. I don't know how, I mean, some companies have made great efforts and others are still kind of,
Yeah, I think what's happened though is there's been such a focus over the last 12 months on the importance of these technologies, and people are starting to really understand what it means to be a connected world and what it feels like to be disconnected, that they're gaining that activation energy to make some of these changes that have been needing to be made. Like I mentioned, DocuSign, but when you can't walk down to the warehouse and look around and see what's there, or you can't necessarily walk over to the office of your shipping clerk to understand where things are, having that kind of global visibility in transportation management systems or warehouse management system is becoming increasingly evident and creating, you're seeing CFOs and CEOs going, where's my information? And folks saying, I can't provide it to you because, we don't have, that's not connected to the internet. I need to go down to the warehouse to run that report kind of thing. So, it's somewhat rare that is the case, but people are actually seeing some of that. So we'll see that. We'll see the business cases, people being able to make those business cases with a lot more clarity now to support implementing some of those technologies. You mentioned cold chain. We've been looking at different cold chain solutions and then temperature monitoring that we don't have now, and realizing we can't see how things are doing on their trip. If we're going to move towards leveraging things like sea freight, where your trip is now 6 weeks versus 6 hours, you need that visibility, and we don't have it. And so that's where folks are starting to realize if we're going to have these solutions in place that are going to allow us to mitigate some of these issues that are happening, we need better technology to do it. So I am seeing that happening. I'm seeing a strong push towards leveraging some of these Internet of Things technologies to do the cold chain monitoring. And it's amazing stuff, and it has some other side benefits, but it also has some complications to it that you don't even think about. And I think this is fascinating. One of the things I've learned over the last couple of years that's been fascinating to me, in fact, we just had a meeting about it this morning, is the trade operations impact these kinds of things. Okay, so imagine you're a company like Sensitech that provides a temp tail monitor that many pharma industry companies use to manage their cold chain. You're a U.S. company. Your technology, your sensors are built in China. Your software is in the United States. And now a company is looking to use those, a global company is looking to use those temp tails in different regions of the world that are on a US embargo list, right? You can't use them there. You can't, and even when it comes to software as a service technologies or different software applications, you may not be able to use them in countries like Iran or the Sudan, or so if you've got affiliates in those regions, it's complicated. It's really complicated to deploy some of those solutions when there may be trade compliance issues that are related to it.
Yeah, that is fascinating, actually, and things that anyone outside of supply chain probably doesn't think about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it even gets more unique, like when you so here we're talking about countries, and you can imagine, thinking about the geopolitical solution over the last several years, where countries are going in and out of our, certainly in the US, going in and out of our embargo lists. That can be pretty frustrating for a CTO or trade compliance officer. But even now, when you start talking about sanctions on individuals, how do we know that we aren't shipping a sanctioned individual in a particular region product? Anyway, it's just incredibly complicated. So these are the sort of things you need to think about when you're looking to deploy some of these technologies, and where are they from? What's their country of origin? What's their export requirements? Any sanctions or embargoes? There was a discussion around, can we use Excel in certain, I mean, it's just amazing what you don't even think about if you're not in supply chain, how these things may have impacts downstream.
Yeah, no, definitely, for sure. Well, Chris, we've covered a lot today. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'm sure our listeners are really learning much, as I have. Before we wrap up today, I just want to see if you have any last thoughts or ideas that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Sure, thank you. Again, kind of hearkening back to where we started, and the central theme as we went through all of this is, I would encourage folks to not overreact, to be thoughtful, to be realistic, to be considerate of everything that's gone through, over this last year. There's so much we can learn, and we should learn, and we should take away and make changes. But overreacting can be just as dangerous as underreacting to this, not just to our supply chain, but to the patients, if it's pharma, or even to your customers, if it's outside of pharma. So be thoughtful about that, be realistic, understand who the right decision makers are, and please really think about what is your reaction process. Really focus energy on how do you make sure you have the right people in the room, you've got the right information, how quickly that can be brought to bear under any circumstances, and that you have the tools you need to make decisions. That's where success can be determined versus failure.
Well said. Well, thank you so much, Chris Flask, for being our guest today. We really appreciate your time and perspectives on this topic.
Thank you. You have a good day, and we'll talk again.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
And I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And most importantly, thanks to you, our valued listeners. I'm grateful for your time each week and hope that you continue to share this podcast. And don't forget to send us your ideas and guest suggestions. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player of choice, and be sure to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, send us a quick note or leave an online review. We would love to share your feedback with our networks. For show notes and additional podcast resources, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another informative and thought-provoking discussion. Until then, make it a great week.